Once you've been inside a prison, you never forget it. I was 19 the first time. And I wonder this morning how many of you have ever been on the inside. I'm not asking if you've ever served time, but I am really curious. It's my own little sociological study. So if you wouldn't mind, right, you could have been visiting, just to get a sense of how many of us have seen the inside. You can look around. So some of you may have walked the long, lonely, kind of creepy, brightly painted, all white halls of the L.B. Moss jail here in Tulsa. And maybe some of you have spent time in the common room of a woman's pod where women dressed in orange eye each other with a mixture of resignation, indignation, and determination, as I have. Maybe you've spent a day leading a meditation group or teaching a life skills class in a state prison. Part of what makes a prison visit so remarkable for those of you who haven't been inside is the feeling of time stopping. Prison is a trap for many things, but it's also a trap for catching time. The basic reality of American prisons is not that of the lock and a key, but that of the lock and the clock, writes Adam Gopnik in a New Yorker article called The Caging of America, which I strongly recommend. We say prisoners are doing time, but they tell us that time is doing them. Prisons are a sociological experiment, which I think is part of why I've been going in and out of them since I was 19, to learn. They're a teaching institution of sorts, not because of the classes they offer, but if you wonder about our fundamental values and beliefs as a society, you learn a lot by going into our prisons. Sometimes I think this whole world is one big prison yard. Some of us are prisoners, and some of us are guards. Those are Bob Dylan's words we heard a little while ago that Dion sang so beautifully. And you see the truth in that song when you stop and think, because it's not just prisoners who are doing time. The guards are doing time too. The children of prisoners certainly are, as are the parents and the partners of the men and women in our extensive prison system, all doing time. Our extensive and expensive prison system. And so more and more of it is privately run across this country, here in Oklahoma by the CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America, which means that people, and we're people, are making a profit by locking up a larger and larger percentage of our own population, and creating what Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, calls a caste state, a term which we usually associate with the country India, where people are divided from the time they're born into certain socioeconomic groupings which they can never escape. But she's describing this caste system here in America, and it is the antithesis to the American dream, which promises that every American can make it, it being success and money and status and education and healthcare and personal safety. If you missed Marlon's sermon last spring on Alexander's book, we have copies for you on your way out the door this morning. You'll also see a sign-up sheet and some other information. Ms. Alexander's thesis is that our prisons are systematically denying primarily black and brown-skinned people of any chance of economic advancement by calling them felons, locking them up, and then returning them to a world in which they are denied the right to vote and can't get work because most people won't hire felons. If you wanted to continue the tradition of separation, subjugation, and servitude because of race, which was slavery and then Jim Crow, you couldn't do it any better, she asserts. There are a lot of people locked up in this country that we call the land of the free. There are now more people under correctional supervision in America than were in the Gulag archipelago under Stalin at its height. More than 6 million people. Here are a few more facts. The United States has fewer than 5% of the world's population, and we have almost a quarter of the world's prisoners. Americans today are locked up for what we used to call petty crimes, things like writing bad checks or using drugs, things that would rarely produce prison sentences in other countries. And in particular, here in the States, we keep people incarcerated far longer than prisoners in other nations. It's actually common knowledge around the world now that our system has made us a rogue state, a country that has made a decision not to follow what is a normal Western being code for civilized, not to follow a normal civilized approach. If that's not bad enough, then there's Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, we incarcerate more women than in any other state. In fact, we incarcerate women at twice the national average here. Thus, we incarcerate more women than in any other nation in the world. We incarcerate black men at the second highest rate in our country. And we lock up men in general at the third highest rate. Some say 1 in 12 Oklahomans have a felony conviction, but state corrections data show that number could be as high as 1 in 8. The sign at our state borders should read, "Come to Oklahoma, where the women and the men are unusually dangerous." This truly is the land of opportunity if you understand that justice requires not just retribution, but restoration, not just revenge, but reconciliation, not just punishment, but promise. And of course, in our country, justice and criminal justice especially is particularly politicized. So I wonder if you've heard of this one. A conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. A liberal is a conservative who's been indicted. And a passionate prison reformer is a conservative who's in one. So whether you're a conservative or a liberal, a libertarian, an independent, or apolitical, Randy and I are here today to not only share some facts and tell you some stories, but to engage you in making a difference here and now in our city and in our state. And so I introduce Randy Lewis.
The question is, why should any of us care? Why would someone like Barbara, someone like you, care about those locked up? I can imagine that she and others care because they live in a world not unto themselves. Perhaps they know someone who may have been addicted or in trouble. We care because you and I know the price of not caring. We care because we are part of a community that values the dignity and worth of humanity, because we are covenanted to look beyond color, beyond economic ability and religious ideology, to experience an unconditional love beyond any belief or failings that someone might have. I care because I'm aware of how communities, in particular those of color, have been decimated by mass incarceration of its young black and brown men. And as a black man, I too have been affected by its snare. One of my earliest childhood memories was that of the large white walls of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. I had to be no more than 5, but I recall this huge fortress with the giant guard towers. I was there with my mother and siblings to visit my father, someone who up until that point I had never met. You see, my father went to prison just prior to my birth. He had originally been given the death penalty for his involvement in a murder, a sentence that was later commuted to life in prison. And and eventual parole when I was 11, followed by his numerous trips to jail, which ultimately resulted in another long incarceration, 16 years to be exact. I'm reminded of my father who died a few years ago, when my brothers and sisters and my mom and I went to the prison to pick him up. He was finally being released on a medical release. He had cancer and he was dying and only had a few months to live. And on that ride back, all he had to say to us was, "I'm sorry," as he cried. See, as a child, I didn't understand the gravity of my father's being in prison. My brothers and sisters would tell me stories about him being a gangster. Beyond that, I knew nothing of him. But what I did know was the hard life we lived as a result of his choices. I witnessed my mother struggling alone to raise 8 kids. I remember living in the projects. That's government housing, for those of you who don't know. I remember the commodity cheese and the powdered eggs. Anybody? Eating cereal with weevils in it. That's bugs, a good source of protein. I remember eating wild rabbits and squirrels for dinner and hand-me-down clothes and shoes and living with the stigma of my father being a convicted and violent criminal. At some point, I realized that it was not just him doing his time, but his wife and children were also doing time with him. And so I had every reason to be an angry and bitter young man because of it. But I chose another way, a better way. But it was not easy. 2 of my brothers weren't so lucky. Their lives were stolen from them in 2 separate acts of violence. You see, besides the mass incarceration, violent death is the second most contributing factor in removing young, predominantly male people of color from our communities. This tremendous loss of earning power serves only to perpetuate the cycle of poverty, and with the limited social and educational opportunities, it helps to create a perfect storm, an environment of hostility guarded by the society's false perceptions and suspicions. And our government would rather spend billions of dollars on confining its people rather than educating its people. Please do not get me wrong. I believe prisons are necessary. I am co-facilitating a criminal thinking class at David L. Moss, and I'm exposed to all types of criminal minds. Some, I believe, really enjoy their criminality, with every indication that they would return to that life upon their release, and for them, prison may be the right place. But for others who do want to change, once out, they discover a system designed in such a way that it is nearly impossible to stay out. It is an unforgiving, punitive system designed to keep them off the grid. As I listen to their stories, I realize that many of these young men and women are mentally and emotionally challenged. Most of them are petty criminals with nonviolent drug or alcohol-related offenses, which could have easily been addressed medically. Now, most of us, we have our access to our therapists, counselors, psychologists, and our antidepressants. But these poor souls do not. As a matter of fact, most of them will not even qualify for Obamacare. Several of them admitted to using drugs to self-medicate against the harsh reality that is their life. These are some of the reasons why I, an African-American minister whose father spent most of his adult life in jail, care about this work. So besides the classes at David L. Moss, I'm involved in the letter writing ministry and a mentoring ministry with former ex-convicts. And we have plans, Barbara and I have plans on expanding this to include legislative and more educational endeavors. Now, one of the gentlemen whom I am mentoring happens to be an inspiring writer. He was in prison for 10 years, where he discovered that he had a gift and started to write a fiction novel. He and I recently sent his first book draft off to a New York publisher, and it got accepted. It was amazing. So now this new writer has new hope to start living, to be a productive member of society. And in my many years of ministry, I have witnessed how transformative it is giving hope to someone who has none. So I can say, yes, we care. We care because we believe in justice, and we know that it is not true justice to treat addiction with prison rather than as a public health crisis. We care that our system of justice should not be merely a punitive system when there are other successful models of rehabilitative and restorative justice. We care because we know that even the most hardened criminals deserve to be treated with dignity and with the recognition of their humanity. Now, most of these men and women will never be able to make good their evil, right their wrongs, correct their mistakes. The only thing left for them is to receive forgiveness. And in many ways, it is not on them, it is on us. The question is not, do they belong? Of course they do. They're human. The question is, how do we show them that they belong? And ultimately, the question is, what will we do to ensure that true justice prevails? Thank you. Now Barbara will come and say a few more words.
I think Randy ended with the words, something about true justice will prevail. When will that day be? Justice would be those two girls being rehabilitated. That's what the mother of 12-year-old Rebecca Sedgwick said in Florida last week, after her daughter jumped off a water tower to her death, after being bullied by those same two girls for years. Justice would be those two girls being rehabilitated. We need a system that would make Rebecca's vision of justice a reality. So I ask you, what do you think justice looks like? Lady Justice is blindfolded. She holds a sword and a scale. Her blindness signifies that she's impartial. For example, she doesn't favor the white victim or offender over the black or the brown. Her sword represents the power of the courts to punish, and the scales represent her responsibility to weigh the evidence when there are competing claims. But there are other images of justice in our world today, some more, others less just. I share a few, and I'm sure you hold your own in your own imaginations. What about this one? An all-white female jury for the trial of a young black man. A young man, after his first psychotic break, has committed his first crime, and now he sits alone in a cell the size of a bathroom for 23 out of 24 hours, and has been there for an entire year without receiving any kind of psychiatric attention. What about King Solomon, when he recognizes the real mother as the one who will not let her baby be cut in two? Or a man who breaks his ankle in our local jail and then receives no medical attention until his friend, a lawyer and a member of our congregation, makes it happen. Or 5 men testifying in our nation's capital on the subject of women's health care. Or a restaurant that hires only felons because the owner knows everyone needs a second chance. Or phone companies who charge inmates up to 6 times the normal long-distance rates to their captive markets because they know they can. Do you recognize justice when you see it and when you don't? Since the Puritans landed in New England, which is a long time ago now, it seems that we, the people of these United States, have been a people engaged in a moral struggle, constantly pulled between competing urges. First, to redeem ourselves, or first, to reform the other. It's a way I find helpful to define the battleground that we call home or America. Those of us on the left insist we must work harder to be good, to do good. Those of us on the right insist we must persuade the other to be good and punish them when they're not. But moral fervor about good and evil motivates all of us and keeps our country's political pendulum swinging back and forth. So who do you blame for poverty and violence and addiction, for the troubles we've seen and are seeing? Do you blame the sinner or the society? Both was the Puritans' answer. They didn't get everything right, those early settlers, but I think this is worth remembering. They said, we preach virtue and prosecute vice because the individual is responsible for his or her actions, just as the covenanted community must take responsibility for its own. Moral fervor without rational analysis is dangerous. James Monroe, in his book Hellfire Nation, argues that prejudice will continue to sneak past the Bill of Rights because of our national obsession with morality. We're bound to honor our fellow citizens and their rights unless our neighbor turns out to be bad, right? If you're bad, then it's okay if we strip you of your lives and your liberty and your legally acquired property. How else could we justify how we treat our own people with addictions, or our own people with mental illnesses, or our own people with different colored skin? But we are inheritors of a free religion, a tradition that stands on the principle that God's purpose in history is to support freedom's unfolding. We affirm the central theme of human existence is a story of human liberation. And we know that because we are free, every one of us has the potential to do good works and bad works. Everyone. So what does that theology have to do with how we as a community can respond to criminal behavior and criminal justice? Well, one theory of crime claims that there's a certain net amount of crime waiting to be expressed, and if you stop it in one place, it will break out in another, so the only way to stop crime is to lock up all the potential criminals. And there's another theory that claims that criminal activity is like most other human choices and struggles. It's a question of context and opportunity. Crime is not the consequence of a set number of criminals. Rather, criminals are the consequence of a set number of opportunities. Crime is a routine behavior, the experts say. It's a thing people do when they get used to doing it. Now, conservatives don't like this view because it shows that being tough doesn't help. And liberals don't like it because it shows that being nice doesn't help either. But I like it because it transcends the American battle for the moral high ground. It means that curbing crime doesn't depend on us being better or making them, whoever they are, be good. Instead, it depends mostly on practical, consistent, small, consistently annoying barriers to crime. So the natural rate of criminal activity deemed dangerous to society and deserving of punishment seems to hover right around 100 per 100,000 people. And the point of a justice system, not a racial caste system, would be to identify that thousandth person and to find a way to keep that person from harming everybody else and give the rest of us a break, which is where we, the average citizen, comes in. Because we're the ones who know about the damage to families and our economy. We're the ones who know how many chances we've been given and needed. We're the ones who know that with our laws, we are creating multiple generations of people who are expecting to serve time in prison. The statistics aren't news, but they still shock. We've been the national leader in women's incarceration in this state for the past 20 years. We've known about it for a generation. In fact, the federal government came to our state to help us because we looked so bad. And do you know what they recommended? Can you guess? After months of studying us, after the experts in the history of corrections and in psychology and sociology and education and criminology all made their reports, they didn't recommend building more prisons. They recommended that we needed to reevaluate and revision our concepts of punishment in this state from early childhood on. They recommended that we think again about what justice looks like. Why and how do you punish kids in your schools? They asked. When and why do you suspend teenagers? What's leading to your high dropout rate? Change those patterns and you will decrease your rates of incarceration, they told us. And we haven't acted yet on their recommendations. But we know if you imagine a punitive God, you will create a punishing state. We know if you teach children they are bad and they deserve punishment, they will believe it and eventually they will probably act on it. And you and I know there is a different way. So there is a lot we can do together, or actually there's a lot we need to do together. Because we have a shared vision of a place beyond moral righteousness, a field, as Rumi described, beyond right-doing and wrongdoing, where we use logic and compassion to hold people accountable and give them second chances. So Randy had a dream when he entered ministry, one we are officially resurrecting today. Years ago, he started a prison ministry, and it had a name, Free Indeed, he called it. And many years ago, when I was 19, I started going in and out of prisons, visiting prisoners, teaching the Alternatives to Violence curriculum. I even started a community resolution team for juvenile first offenders in Maine. There are more stories to tell that we won't tell this morning. And I want you to know that this morning we are starting All Souls Free Indeed Prison Ministry. And I know you're not all looking for something to do, because I know a lot of you and you're awfully busy already, but there is so much we can do and need to do. And I'm just going to give you a sampling this morning in case you're somebody looking. We need to write letters to inmates. Randy and I get too many letters to answer, and we haven't even sort of started this and reached out. Here's one unopened envelope. I am so eager. We can send liberal religious materials into our jails and prisons where they are desperately needed. There are none currently in the state of Oklahoma. We can advocate for criminal justice reforms, and there are plenty of studies to back us up. We can hold our legislators accountable. Just a quick overview of the costs per offender per day to be in prison per day, $129. To be on probation, only $2.92. To be on community sentencing, $2.53. Mental health court, $25. Drug court, $15 a day. There's no economic argument for what we're doing right now except for profit, putting profit in some people's pockets. I hope you might consider attending our own member Judge Bill Kello's class this January. I would love to work with people to start a community resolution team right here in Tulsa for our juvenile first offenders. We can be the people who are willing to hire felons. And we can start a Ban the Box campaign, something I just learned about, which encourages businesses to get rid of that box where people check off whether or not they have a criminal record. We all have a limited amount of time here. You have to choose what you do with your own time. The highest compliment they say you can give someone in prison is that she knows how to do her time well. I know I do not want anyone shackled or chained or raped or dehumanized or deprived of a future or isolated or kept in solitary confinement on my behalf. And I do not want us to wage a war against our own people. Do you?